So the question comes up, how long are you going to stay in the hospital after you have the baby? And things have really changed. You know, years ago, people would stay a week or longer after having a baby in the hospital. That is certainly not the case anymore. After a vaginal delivery, most people will stay 1 or 2 nights after having their baby. And after a C-section, most people will stay 3 or 4 nights. But occasionally people will only stay 2 nights. Every situation is different, and a lot of it will also depend on what's going on with the baby. Some people say they want to be in the hospital as long as possible. To me, I think that's a bit of a mistake. Hospital is not a great place to be in. It's kind of like being in prison. I mean, people bring you food, they tell you when you can eat, you can't leave or you get in trouble. There's all kinds of things. You really lose a lot of your freedom. But even more importantly, in the hospital, there's a lot of sick people, maybe not necessarily on your ward, but there are sick people in the hospital, which means there's a lot of bad bacteria floating around the hospital. And so I don't think it's a good place to be any longer than you need to be there. So for me, I think you ought to get out of the hospital as soon as it's safe to do that. And that generally means usually 1 night after a vaginal delivery, although occasionally longer, or 2 or 3 nights after a C-section. Now, in some states, there's actually laws about that. In the state of California, you have the legal right to stay in the hospital 48 hours after delivery for a vaginal delivery, and really in 4 days, legally you have the right to stay in the hospital after having a C-section. In other words, your insurance has to pay for that length of time. But really, I think that time is a little excessive for most people, and you're really better off at home than you are in the hospital. Just as a bit of interest, in California, the reason that legislation happened is there was a big earthquake in Northridge, California a while back. And the hospital right at the epicenter basically had to triage. And they set this big tent up in their parking lot, which is where they were delivering babies. And because of this natural disaster, for the first few days to a week, they were basically watching women about 4 hours after delivery and then letting them go home because they didn't have the resources because they were taking care of so many injured people from the earthquake. The insurance companies started taking note of that and started talking about, well, maybe we can get patients out of the hospital after 4 hours on a regular basis to save a lot of money. And that's when the state of California passed legislation to keep that from happening. Just a little piece of history that I thought was sort of interesting.